Harold and Lillian Martinson were the kind of couple everyone admired, quiet, kind, and rooted in a life of simple routine. Dylan and Marissa Forrester were the picture of youthful charm, new to town, eager to fit in, and seemingly harmless. But within weeks of their arrival, the Martinsons vanished without a trace, and the Forresters disappeared just as quickly. By the time the truth was uncovered, it was already too late. An older couple had been replaced, their lives stolen in silence, and no one in Meadowbrook had seen it coming. Meadowbrook was the kind of town where nothing ever seemed to happen. Nestled between wooded hills and open fields, it was a place where children rode bikes until sunset, neighbors greeted each other by name, and local gossip rarely went beyond bake sales and weather reports. So when a young couple moved into the neighborhood in early spring, it naturally became the talk of the town. Dylan and Marissa Forrester arrived in a modest silver hatchback, unloading boxes and potted plants into the small red brick rental on Oak Hollow Drive. They said they were from upstate, looking for a fresh start away from the noise of city life. Their smiles were warm, their manner polite, and they blended in almost too well. Down the street, at the end of Sycamore Lane, lived Harold and Lillian Martinson. Married for nearly 50 years, they were one of Meadowbrook's oldest and most respected couples. Harold had once taught math at the local high school, while Lillian had been the town librarian. Even in retirement, they remained active, attending church every Sunday, volunteering at the community center, and hosting monthly book club gatherings that brought neighbors together over tea and homemade pie. Their white cottage, trimmed in blue, was always spotless. The hedges were carefully clipped, and the roses in their front garden were the pride of the block. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Dylan and Marissa were friendly but not intrusive. They walked their dog every morning, waved to passers-by, and often sat outside in the evenings with cups of coffee. Neighbors commented on how refreshing it was to see young people settling down in a town mostly filled with retirees and families. Some even said the couple reminded them of a younger version of the Martinsons, but then, small things began to shift. The Martinsons, who never missed a Sunday service, suddenly stopped coming to church. Lillian's book club meetings were quietly cancelled. Their garden, once impeccably maintained, began to show signs of neglect, rose petals left to wither, hedges growing uneven. When a neighbor stopped by with fresh muffins and knocked on their door, no one answered. The car remained parked in the driveway, but the curtains stayed closed for days. Meanwhile, Dylan and Marissa seemed to grow more reserved. Their once frequent walks became rare. They no longer chatted with neighbors, and lights in their home flickered late into the night. No one thought much of it, maybe they were just adjusting. People assumed the Martinsons were visiting family, perhaps taking a well-earned vacation. In a town like Meadowbrook, no one expected the worst. What no one realized at the time was that two very different lives were unraveling side by side. One couple was quietly vanishing, while another was settling in just a little too comfortably. It would be weeks before anyone questioned the silence, and by then, the damage had already been done. The peaceful facade of Meadowbrook was beginning to crack, and behind it lay a secret no one could have imagined. The first real sign that something was wrong came when Mrs. Donnelly, the neighbor who lived directly across from the Martinsons, noticed the mail overflowing from their box. At first, she chalked it up to them being out of town. Maybe they took a spontaneous trip or were visiting their daughter out west. But as days turned into a week, concern started to spread. The once perfect lawn began to look neglected. Weeds sprouted in the flowerbeds, and the trash bins sat untouched at the curb. It wasn't like Harold and Lillian to leave things unkept. They had routines, and they never strayed from them. Their home had always been a picture of discipline and care. Now, it looked forgotten. Meanwhile, Dylan and Marissa's house grew eerily quiet. The young couple had been around less and less. Their dog, once always seen trotting along during walks, hadn't been spotted in days. A neighbor who tried to drop off a borrowed ladder found the house locked and lifeless. Then, Seemingly overnight, they were gone. Their car disappeared, and the windows that had once glowed with warm light now stared blankly onto the street. No one had seen them leave. No moving truck, no goodbyes, not even a packed vehicle. They simply vanished. It wasn't until a city maintenance crew arrived on Sycamore Lane to check the aging sewer lines that the real horror emerged. Workers were crawling beneath the Martinsons' house when one of them noticed a strange odor. At first, they thought it was a dead animal. But as they dug deeper into the crawlspace, they found two bodies wrapped in weather-worn canvas. The discovery sent shockwaves through Meadowbrook. Police were called immediately, and the street was quickly sealed off with yellow tape. The quiet little neighborhood turned into a crime scene overnight. Forensic teams arrived and carefully removed the remains. Although decomposed, the bodies were soon confirmed to be Harold and Lillian Martinson. The cause of death was brutal, blunt force trauma to the head. There were signs of a struggle, but no evidence of forced entry. Whoever had killed them had likely done so inside the home and then hidden them below, right beneath the very floorboards that once echoed with their footsteps. Detectives searched the house and found it oddly untouched. Their belongings were in place, no valuables stolen, no electronics missing. But there were strange clues. Receipts dated after the estimated time of death were found in the kitchen. Purchases had been made using Harold's credit card, groceries, gasoline, and fast food from a chain near the highway. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed a couple matching Dylan and Marissa's description, although the footage was grainy and unhelpful in confirming identities. As the investigation deepened, the focus shifted toward the young couple who had so recently disappeared. Questions swirled around the town. Who were Dylan and Marissa really? Why had they come to Meadowbrook? And how had they managed to live just blocks from their victims without raising suspicion? The picture was only beginning to form, and what it revealed would terrify the community even more. Investigators began digging into every trace they could find about Dylan and Marissa Forrester. But the deeper they looked, the more confusing it became. There were no solid records of either of them before 2 years ago. No childhood addresses, no high school transcripts, no social security numbers that matched their names. Their drivers' licenses turned out to be expertly forged, their rental application contained fake employment references, and the phone numbers they had provided went straight to voicemail boxes that were soon disconnected. It was as if they had appeared out of thin air, lived in Meadowbrook just long enough to blend in, and then vanished without a trace. The local police, realizing the complexity of the case, contacted the FBI. When federal agents reviewed the evidence, something chilling emerged. A similar case had been flagged 2 years earlier in Colorado. A retired couple went missing, and their home had been temporarily occupied by a young couple using different names. The older couple's remains were found buried beneath the garden shed months later. Then there was a case in Oregon. Another elderly couple gone. Another young couple vanished after a brief stay in the neighborhood. The pattern was too precise to be a coincidence. In each case, the victims were older, childless, or estranged from family and known to be predictable in their habits. The imposters always presented themselves as a charming young couple, quiet, polite, and trustworthy. In Meadowbrook, residents were horrified to learn that the friendly young couple they had welcomed could be part of a string of cold, calculated killings. The crime scene at the Martinsons' house was analyzed again, this time with greater scrutiny. There were no fingerprints, no DNA traces left behind that could be used to identify the suspects. Whoever Dylan and Marissa were, they were meticulous. Experts believed they had studied the Martinsons for weeks, maybe even months, before making their move. They had mimicked the elderly couple's routines, quietly taken over their lives, and used their identities until it was time to move on. Authorities began to suspect that the couple's motivation wasn't just financial. Although credit cards had been used, the spending was minimal and almost careless. It wasn't about getting rich, it seemed to be about control. The thrill of stepping into someone else's life and making it disappear. The fake names, the forged documents, the seamless blending into new towns all pointed to a deeper, more disturbing motive. Then came a possible break. A traffic camera hundreds of miles away in Nebraska picked up a vehicle matching the description of the one Dylan and Marissa had last been seen driving. It was registered under yet another name, with temporary tags that were traced back to a stolen identity. Investigators knew they were dealing with professionals, people who planned every move, left no digital footprint, and stayed constantly ahead of the law. As the search widened, so did the sense of unease across the country. These weren't just killers. They were ghosts in the system. And no one knew where they would appear next. The vehicle spotted in Nebraska led investigators to a paper trail that, while faint, offered a direction. A rural real estate transaction had been completed under the name Caleb Wright, a man who, upon further examination, did not exist. The purchase was for a remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Utah, nestled between dense pines and hidden from major roads. It was the kind of place one wouldn't stumble upon without knowing exactly where to look. After weeks of dead ends and digital forensics, the FBI assembled a team and moved in carefully, unsure of what they would find. What they discovered was more disturbing than they had imagined. The cabin sat in near silence, surrounded by thick brush and snow-dusted trees. A rusted truck sat outside, half covered by a tarp, with no visible plates. The windows were dark and the chimney cold. But agents noted movement, subtle shifts behind the blinds. A slow, deliberate operation was launched. Drones confirmed 2 individuals inside. The team surrounded the property, and within an hour, both suspects were taken into custody without resistance. They claimed their names were Caleb and Fiona Wright, but neither name matched any government records. Inside the cabin was a trove of unsettling items. Shelves lined with burner phones, folders of forged documents, and detailed maps marked with pins and circles. There were notebooks filled with pages of handwritten notes about elderly couples, addresses, daily routines, grocery lists, schedules, even preferred walking routes. Each profile ended the same way, a red X drawn beside the name and a coded set of dates. Alongside these notes were printed newspaper clippings of obituary announcements and missing persons reports. The pattern was undeniable. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence of their next intended targets. Taped to the wall was a list titled "Clean Pairs," with 3 elderly couples listed by name and address, each in small towns across 3 different states. Meadowbrook had simply been one stop in a longer journey, part of a twisted and methodical path. These weren't random killings. They were carefully selected operations, rehearsed and executed with precision. The couple didn't just kill, they replaced. Digital forensics teams recovered several encrypted files from a laptop found beneath the cabin floorboards. The contents revealed even more. Video files, likely taken with hidden cameras, showed fragments of conversations, views from inside homes, even shots of mailboxes and driveways. The killers had surveilled their victims for weeks, recording everything to perfect their infiltration. As agents processed the evidence, behavioral analysts worked to understand the psychological makeup of the pair. They weren't driven by desperation or need. They were calculated, intelligent, and deeply disturbed. Their enjoyment came not from violence itself, but from the act of becoming someone else, of slipping unnoticed into lives they would eventually erase. It wasn't about money. It was about power and control, the thrill of the swap, and the belief they could keep doing it forever. But now their secrets were exposed. The ghosts had faces. And their trail of silent disappearances was finally at an end, with both suspects in custody and the truth beginning to surface. The investigation widened beyond Meadowbrook. Teams were dispatched to every property and location linked to the couple's string of false identities. What followed was a grim sequence of discoveries that connected missing persons cases long considered cold or forgotten. In Oregon, investigators exhumed a shallow grave beneath a collapsed greenhouse, uncovering a couple who had disappeared nearly 3 years earlier. In Colorado, skeletal remains were found hidden behind a basement wall in a home that had once been rented under another set of aliases. Each location matched the pattern: a quiet neighborhood, a trusted older couple, and a seemingly innocent young pair who arrived shortly before everything fell apart. The couple had perfected the art of impersonation. Their crimes weren't rushed or reckless, they were rehearsed. They studied their targets for months, memoized routines, mimicked behaviors, and wore their victims' identities like clothing. Once settled, they used financial accounts sparingly, just enough to maintain the illusion, never enough to trigger suspicion. When they disappeared, they left behind clean crime scenes and confusion. Most of the victims had few close family members, and those who tried to report them missing were often reassured that the couple had simply moved or taken a break. Back in Meadowbrook, the Martinsons were laid to rest in a service attended by nearly the entire town. Their story had reached national news, and their home, once a symbol of peace and routine, became a quiet landmark of loss and betrayal. The rose bushes Lillian had cared for so tenderly were left to grow wild. No one wanted to touch them, as if pruning the flowers might erase what had happened there. The white cottage now stood empty, its windows shuttered and its front gate padlocked, casting a long shadow over the street it once brightened. The suspects refused to cooperate during questioning, though they were identified through fingerprints and DNA. Their real names were never confirmed. Every traceable document they possessed had been altered or forged. Without confession, investigators relied entirely on evidence, files, surveillance, and the trail of victims. Behavioral experts described them as chameleons, cold, manipulative, and eerily detached from emotion. The woman kept a journal, later recovered from a hidden compartment in the cabin. In it, she referred to their crimes as exchanges, writing about the thrill of living behind someone else's front door and the challenge of learning a new identity down to the smallest detail. She wrote of her victims with clinical distance, often describing them as chapters in a story. The case was labeled as one of the most bizarre and chilling series of identity-driven homicides in recent FBI history. With mounting evidence, prosecutors prepared to charge the couple with multiple counts of murder, identity theft, and fraud across several states. Meadowbrook would never forget what happened. What began as a strange disappearance became a national tragedy, a story of how trust was shattered by two faces that no one really knew. The house remains empty, a reminder of lives stolen and peace forever disrupted.